Hello, I'm Miss Becky from the Montgomery County Norristown Public Library, and today I'm going to show you how to make a pumpkin decorated hot pad. Now, a hot pad, also known as a pot holder, is something that you use in the kitchen to, you can put it down on your table to put a hot dish or pot on top of so that it doesn't ruin the table, or you can use it to pick up hot pots from the stove or the oven. We're going to make one of these, and if you've ever done any of my cooking videos, tutorials with me, you could easily use the hot pad for when you do recipes in the kitchen. Okay, so if you've gotten the packet from the library, you will have received 4 pieces of material. You'll have an orange square, a square of fallish themed fabric, and another square of fallish themed fabric with a pumpkin shape cut out the center, and a piece of batting. And this is the fluffy stuff that goes inside a quilt to make it soft and warm. So these are what you would have gotten in the packet from the library if you picked one up. If you didn't pick one up, along with this tutorial, there should be a link in the description section on YouTube directing you to our website, where there will be a posting of the template. And if you don't want to go to all that trouble, or if you don't feel like looking for it, you can make your own template. You can use, this is a 6.5 inch square, and you can cut out of scrap paper or scrap cardboard. And then I just free-handed a outline of a pumpkin there. You need to stay about 1.5 inches away from the edges to make sure you have enough room to sew. And when I drew the pumpkin, I folded my template in half, and when I cut out, I cut out just the half of the pumpkin, and then when you open it up, then your pumpkin is symmetrical. Plus, it's easier to cut out when you cut like that. And then you have a template. You could use this same idea for any number of festive themes. You could do an outline of a fall leaf. You could do, for other holidays, you could do maybe a star for Christmas, or just for fun. Or you could do bunny for Easter or whatever. You could have a whole collection of holiday hot pads if you want to take this a step further. But for now, we're going to do a pumpkin, and I'm going to show you how it's done. So what else you're going to need? You're going to need some straight pins. I have my pinned tomato here, and I purchased, well, actually I inherited these from my mother-in-law, but these pins with the round heads on them, which just makes them easier to see and easier to pull out. But you can use any kind of straight pin. I know a lot of people have this kind with just a kind of a flat head on it, and that will work just as well. If you've gotten a hand sewing packet from the library, I would have given you that kind of pin. You may want to have a needle and thread to close up the gap when we turn the pot holder right side out after we sew it. But we'll come to that later. And you'll need a pair of sharp scissors. And if you're cutting your own template, you'll notice that I cut this pumpkin shape with a kind of a zigzaggy edge to it. And that is done with what was called pinking shears. And they're scissors with a zigzaggy edge on the blade. And they cut this fun pattern on the edge of your fabric. And sometimes people use that. It's supposed to help keep your edges of your fabric from fraying. So some people like to cut the edges of their fabric with that, so the edges don't fall apart. So we're gonna now assemble this. We're gonna kind of make a sandwich. We're gonna start with the solid piece, and we're going to put that right side up. Then we're going to lay the cutout piece on top, and make sure if it matters, if your pattern, make sure your patterns are going in the right direction. And then you're going to put, so the bottom one's face up, the cutout one's face down. The orange one goes on top of that, face down. And then we got this on top of everything. So now we're going to pin all of these layers together. So I'm just going to put a few pins here just to make sure things don't move around while we're sewing. Like maybe one in each corner. And you never want to pin things parallel to the edge like this, because it's harder to take them out when you're sewing. If you're sewing like this and your pins are like this, it's hard to get them out. It's easier when they're facing this way, with the points towards the edge of the fabric. So if you're making this yourself without the help of the library packet, make sure that all of your materials are made of cotton, because cotton will not melt when you get it hot. Most of a lot of the cheaper batting that you'll find in the fabric store is polyester, and polyester doesn't like heat very much. So you want to make sure, if you accidentally touch a burner or something with the edge of your hot pad, that it doesn't melt. It might burn, but it won't melt. Okay, so now we're going to sew this, and I guess I forgot to mention that a very important thing that you need is a sewing machine, which when I mentioned that, when I advertise this as a sewing project, a machine sewing project, I would hope you would know that you needed that. Okay, so we're going to start by sewing along, we're going to start in the middle, and we're going to sew all the way around the square. And we're going to leave about 2 inches open, unsewed on one side, so that we have a place to turn things right side out. So you're going to make sure your machine is threaded with thread that matches your project, or contrast, whatever you prefer. And we are going to use the side of our presser foot as our guide for how wide to make our seam. That makes about 1/4 of an inch seam. So when you put your fabric in, you're going to line it up even with the edge of your presser foot. You're going to put the longer edge of your material facing away from the sewing machine, because if you sewed it like this, you'd have everything bunched up over here. So you never want to sew like that. You always want to sew with your shortest edge inside the machine and the rest of it hanging on the outside. Okay, so we got our presser foot edge lined up with the edge of the fabric. We're going to make sure you put your presser foot down, because if you don't, it just sews all crazy. And then we're going to start sewing. And when you first sew, we're going to do a little backup stitch just to make it stronger there at the opening when we turn things right side out. And you'll understand as we go along. So I'm going to start sewing. Oop, come on, machine. Now I'm just going to back up a little bit. And I forgot to mention, I always say this in my sewing classes, always know where your threads are. Always make sure you have a good long lead of thread, because if you don't, when the needle goes up, the tension on the thread pulls the needle or pulls the thread out of the needle, so that you have problems. So make sure you always know where your threads are when you start. I always like to keep a hold of them a little bit and do a couple stitches before I start, just to make sure everything's secure and where it's supposed to be. So now we're going to sew down the edge, always keeping the presser foot even with the edge of the fabric. I'm going to get rid of this pin before we get to it, because sometimes if you sew over a pin, it's not pretty. So we're going to sew almost to the edge of the fabric, but not quite. We're going to stop right about a seam's width away, so like a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. You're going to stop. You're going to put your needle down into the fabric. You're going to lift your presser foot, and you're going to turn your fabric. Put your presser foot back down, and you have completed your first corner pivot. So now we're going to keep sewing, keeping our presser foot even with the edge. And if you have a mark, some machines have marks showing fractions, 3/8, 1/4, 4/4, can't speak, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, mine has 4/8 as a half. However wide you want your seam, you can also use those marks as your guide. Using the presser foot is pretty easy. It's easy to see visually, and then it's usually a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of your presser foot. So it's a pretty good measuring guide. So we're going to keep going. I'm going to get rid of this. And we have the batting is a little funny to work with, and sometimes it stretches a little bit and gets a little bit longer than the other fabric. So just go by the fabric underneath as much as you can. So if you get a little off kilter there, you just follow what's underneath. And it's best to put the batting on top, because sometimes it gets caught in the little feed dogs, little jaggedy things underneath there that push the fabric through. So you want to be able to keep track of where it is and how it's bunching up, if it's bunching up. So now we did the pivot. Always make sure you put your presser foot down after you turn. Take out our pins as we go. And you see how easy that is to pull it out from this side, away from the stitching and the sewing machine. Okay, I'm going to take this one out. Almost to the end there. And maybe one more stitch. Okay, put needle down, press your foot up, and you turn it. Put your presser foot down and keep going. Always sew slowly until you're really sure of what you're doing, because if you're not sure and you lose control, then you got a lot of stitches just rip out, because that's when mistakes happen. So we're almost around to the last stretch here, so I'm going to leave about this much open. So I'm just going to sew to about there, and you can use a pencil and make marks if that helps you, or you can, put some pins there to remind you not to sew it all the way closed. So I'm going to go just a little bit more this way. Okay, about to there, and then I'm going to just back up a couple stitches just to strengthen that opening so it doesn't all come apart. Okay, make sure your needle is up. Pull out your thread. I have my handy dandy thread cutter here, or you use your scissors and cut off your thread. Okay, so now we are going to we're going to do a little bit of trimming before we turn this right side out. So before you turn it right side out, we're going to trim off. I'm going to get rid of that thread right there. And we're gonna trim off the corners. We're just gonna go diagonally across, and make sure you do not cut your threads, your stitches. So we're just gonna clip that right there. And you see, I got very close to the stitches, but I didn't cut them. And the reason we do this is so that there's not so much fabric stuck in the corners, and when you turn it right side out, you don't have all this stuff bunching. And that's especially important when we have all of these layers that we need to accommodate for. So, and if you want, this is a little bit tricky to do, but you can sort of kind of, maybe not. I was going to say trim down the batting, but, you know, you could actually. But just be careful that you don't trim it all off. Kind of fold it up away from the other. You don't want to trim too close to the stitching. Maybe take like 1/8 of an inch off. That'll give you less bulk. Yeah, I'm not doing this very well. That'll give you less bulk when you go to sew. Some sewing machines don't like a lot of thick layers to sew through, so you may have a little issue. I'm gonna let this side was a little bit shorter to begin with, so I'm just gonna maybe around where the hole is where you turn it. That might be a good place to trim it if you don't trim anywhere else. Come on. Make sure you don't have the under fabric. I'm gonna leave that one go. Okay. So we've trimmed off here, and now we're going to open up between the two outer layers right there. In my case, they're green. They might be green for you, or brown, or whatever you've chosen for your outer layers. But the non-orange part, and this is a little bit hard because it's so thick. You just kind of roll it up so that it'll fit through your little hole there. Pull it up. Okay, make sure you're, and maybe we should have done this a different way, but live and learn. Okay. So now we're sort of right side out, but we need to poke out the corners. So I have a pencil here. You can use a knitting needle, crochet hook. Ooh, see, that's what you don't want to do. You don't want to push so hard that you poke out. So you do this very gently. Get your point. You can use a knitting needle or any kind of dull, like an clicked ballpoint pen, and just find all your corners. This one didn't come out so much, so I'm just going to sort of prod that open, and then just, and see, if we hadn't clipped off those corners, we'd have all that fabric bunched up in there, and there'd be a big lump there, and that wouldn't be very nice. Okay, so we're going to, now, another thing that I should have told you would be helpful to have is an iron and an ironing board or something to iron on. Okay, so we're all turned out now, and what we need to do is turn under these unsewn edges so that they're flat. So that's why we need the iron, and to flatten everything else down as well. So now we're going to fold these edges in. We're going to pull them under 1/4 inch, the same amount as our seam that we sewed. So just sort of pinch it and push it down. And we're just going to iron this whole thing so that it's nice and flat. You can kind of do this. Just be careful that you don't catch your iron in the cutout. Okay, so we're going to... Alright, so you see, I can't even find it. There it is. You see that it's even with the rest. That's where the hole was that we turned. And we just want to make sure it's pinned down, folded down like the rest of it. Now this is something you can do if you want, that just helps hold this together, is to take a needle and thread. I've already threaded the needle, and make sure it's knotted. You wrap it around your finger. Where the threads cross, you pinch it with your thumb, roll it off the end of your finger, and pinch and pull till it's tight. Now, if you want to sew this, I like to kind of hide my knot up underneath so you can't see it. So I come up inside the fold where we folded it over and come out right at the edge with my needle and thread. And that's kind of bunched up in there, which sometimes happens. It's got knotty knots. This is, I wasn't paying attention. Okay. There, all better. Make sure if you're using double threads, make sure that they're even together. Okay, so I'm going to show you the ladder stitch. And you came up here, and you're going to go straight across to the other side, and you're going to take a stitch up underneath and come up here. Pull it up. Now you're going to go across to the other side on this side, from this side to this side, and you're going to go down in the other side on the very edge of the fold, if you can see that, and then take a stitch and come up, pull it tight. So it makes like ladder stitches straight across. So now we're going to come over this way. We're just going to go back and forth, straight across, come up a stitch, pull it tight, go back onto the other side, make sure you're exactly straight across, make a stitch in the fold, come up and tighten it, and you see, you almost can't see. If you do it right, you can hardly even see where I sewed. So then just, again, you're on this side, come straight across on this side, right in there, go right in the fold, do a stitch, come up on this side, pull it tight. And you see when you pull it tight, your stitch disappears. Go straight across to the other side, do a stitch, come up in the fold, pull tight. Let's see how much more we have to go. Okay. Keep doing that, back and forth, stitch this side, come up. Try to keep your stitches even though you can't really see them. It'll hold together better if they're all the same length. Find where my camera is, ever. Do you see that? Or do you not see that? Those stitches just disappear in there. This is a good stitch to know when you're sewing pillows. because you do, it's the same technique to make a pillow, to leave a hole open so you can turn it right side out, and then we have to sew the hole shut. And if you don't want anyone to see where your stitches came, then you do it this way. You'll never know. Okay. Almost there. Don't pull them too tight, because then you'll be all puckered up and it defeats the whole purpose of trying to hide your stitches. Just stay inside your fold as much as you can. We're getting close to the end of the hole, so it's harder to find the edge. I think maybe one more will do it. See, you almost can't see where I sewed. And then I'm going to do one across. I'm going to catch the other side. Try not, this part might show a little bit. There's not really anything you can do about it. So you pull your stitch almost tight, but you leave a little loop. And then you bring your needle through the loop and pull it tight. And then make another one right next to it, another little stitch. Again, almost tight. Put your needle through the loop, pull it tight. Now we're going to go down into the fold, and again, doesn't matter what size stitch. I'm making a wide one so that my tail will be hidden inside. And you kind of pull it tight, clip it off. And see, you can't really, unless you really look hard, you can't really tell where I sewed there. So just take your time. If you want that hole to be closed, we are going to top stitch around the edge. So if you want to skip that part, you can. But just know that you have to make sure you catch those edges of the opening when you sew, or else you'll have the edges will pop out, and that won't be pretty. So we're going to move back to the sewing machine and finish this off. Now we're going to top stitch around the edge. I always like to start at an edge in the middle of a seam, and you're going to need about 1/8 of an inch. You're going to come in, you don't want to go all the way to the presser foot edge, because you want to be able to catch those underneath your seam allowance on the inside. You want to sew on top of that. So if you have markings, you can do 1/8 of an inch, like I have right here on mine. Or you can just kind of eyeball it, or if you want to take a ruler and a pencil and mark 1/8 of an inch around the outside so you can follow where to sew. Or my presser foot has kind of a little groove right there that makes it more like 1/8 of an inch, so that's what I'm going to follow. Or you can take, like I've done here, a piece of tape, measure from your needle over 1/8 of an inch, and just run a piece of tape just so you have a guide, so your stitches don't go crazy all over the place. So I'm just gonna, actually I'm gonna follow my plate guide at 1/8 of an inch there. And like I said, some machines are gonna not be happy about sewing through so many layers, but just go slow and be patient. Make sure you know where your threads are. Hang on to them for a couple of stitches until your machine gets going. You hear that? It's not really liking this very much. I need to give it a little encouragement. Okay, so you go to the corner, almost off, but not quite. And we're going to be a little closer now because we have a narrower seam. So we're going to put your needle down in, turn it. The needle keeps it right in line so we don't lose where we've sewn. I'm going to keep going. See, I had to give it a little bit of a push. Normally your machine will make itself go, but it got a little bogged down in the corner, so I had to give it a little bit of a push. Okay, one more. Press your foot, give it a pivot, put it back down. Yep, see how that kind of doesn't want to sew over that corner. So might just have to give it a tiny little push there. And I find sometimes when I top stitch that I like to make my stitches a little wider. If you can change, or longer I should say, if you can change how long your stitches are so that they're not so short, so that sometimes that helps with the top stitching. And this just gives it a little added strength on the edges, gives it a little decorative look. And come up on the last corner. Turn. And this is where we started here. So we're just going to go down to where we started. And you're just going to sew over where you sewed before, and if you want, you can do a couple of back stitches just to make it extra strong there. And then you pull it out and clip off your threads. Clip them close so that you don't have them sticking up there. Okay, so now, got that part done. Now we're going to stitch around the pumpkin. And now this, let's see, we can do the 1/4 inch seam here. And I would suggest you start on straight, or the straighter side. And we're just going to keep our presser foot. And here I'm doing exactly what I told you not to do, opposite of what I told you to do before. Okay, now I'm confused. Never mind. Just keep your presser foot even with the edge of the cutout. And go slow on the turns. If you need to, put your needle down and pivot a little to get around. You can do that. Just want to make sure your stitches are even. I'm just going to pivot around this edge here a little bit. I don't know why my light is flickering here. There we go. Oops, I didn't have my needle down. So when you want to pivot, make sure you remember to put your needle down. I am a bad role model. when you're pivoting around the curve, you just do a little turn at a time. Okay, so now we're up to the stem end. We're going to stop a 1/4 of an inch away, and we're going to pivot. And go up above, pivot here, up above the stem. Go about 1/4 of an inch beyond. Do another pivot. Come down. Okay. Another pivot. Come around. Pivot this a little bit. A little more pivot. Just a little. And then you sew right over, same as the top stitch, go a little bit past where you ended up. Do a back stitch or two if you want, just to secure. And then we're gonna clip our threads. Okay. So now we've sewn around the outside. Now we're going to put the lines in the pumpkin, and if you want to, just take a pencil and make some light guidelines. You know how the pumpkin has those segments or the lines? You can, I think 3 is probably good. And make sure the outer ones are kind of curved along the same way the edge of the pumpkin is curved, so that it looks 3-dimensional, kind of. And then if you want to do straight lines, you can do it that way. I kind of want mine to look like a real pumpkin. So I'm going to start here. Okay, find my threads. There's 1. There's 2. Okay. So I'm going to hold on to my threads. And I'm just going to follow that line that I just drew. And all the way around. Keep your fabric flat as you go. You see that I'm curving around a little bit. Sort of following the curve. And we're going to come down to here. Oop. I wanted to stay there. Put your needle down because you're going to pivot. You're going to go up that center line. Oh, I didn't like that much. Neither did my machine. Don't know what happened. But I have to rethread and start. I think I'm going to go back over what I just sewed. See, sometimes little mishaps happen. I don't know why that happened like that. I'll clip that off. When your thread breaks, you should always clip it with the scissors so it has a blunt end to go in to your needle. Some newer sewing machines or more expensive sewing machines have a needle threader, which mine does, except it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so I'm going to clip both of these threads so we don't get confused. All right, so what was I doing? I was sewing down here. Before I was so rudely interrupted by breaking thread. Okay. I'm just going to sew over where I sewed. Put your needle down in, and we're going to pivot, and then we're going to go up that center line. That's better. That center line. Okay, all the way to the top where you started stitching there before. Put your needle down. We're going to pivot again. Okay, I'm going to move this up a little bit more. Okay. And then we're going to sew around that last line. End up at the center point there. Do a stitch or two just to finish everything off good. Okay. So now we're going to clip off our threads again, right where they come out of the fabric. So there we go. So here's our finished hot pad, and we've got our little lines in our pumpkin to make them look a little more three-dimensional, and you get the pumpkin outline on the back as well, and that all helps hold the batting together so it doesn't shift inside and get lumpy and uneven. So that's always good when you're using something like this to hold a pan or keep a hot pan on. And these can go in the washer and the dryer. They should be fine. And this is what is known as reverse applique. Now, applique is a sewing technique that uses, it's basically a patch. And you can take, if you cut out your own, you can take your pumpkin shape and sew it onto another piece of fabric. Sew it around. I know it's hard to see there because it's the same fabric, but pretend this is a piece of fabric, and you can just sew your pumpkin on like a patch for another decorative embellishment on something that you're sewing. Quilters use the applique sometimes if they're making a special you know, like they're sewing on a little animal shape or something onto a quilt, they'll use the applique. Usually when you applique, you turn under your edges, but on a round thing it's kind of tricky because you sort of have to fold things over so that you get the curve, or if it's a curve going the other way, you have to clip things. So it's easier to just use the raw edge and sew like this. After you use this and after you wash it, that'll fray a little bit, but that's okay. It'll add some little rustic charm to your project, and you're good to go. And this is you can, as I said before, you can make this design with something different in the middle, like a fall leaf or a Christmas tree or whatever. You can make it bigger. I just did this 6 inches because it's quick and easy the smaller it is. So go ahead and have fun with this and let me know, show me pictures of what you've created. You can post it to our Facebook page under our announcement for the project, or you can email me at rhoover@mclink.org. Email me a picture of your finished project. I'd love to see it. I'd love to know that you guys are out there sewing and having fun.